For 12 years, my ex-wife has told anybody who'd listen that she left me because I couldn't remember to flush a toilet. Told it at Thanksgiving. Told it to my own son like it was a punchline. Told a courtroom mediator once with a straight face like it belonged in the same sentence as 28 years of marriage. She never once told any of them the actual reason. I did. Just not to her. I'm 60 years old. This isn't a story about a bathroom habit. It's a story about what a person will let the world believe about you, so long as it keeps them from having to explain what they actually did. Let me back up. I live outside Springfield, Missouri, in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on Kearney Street, the kind of place a man moves into when a marriage ends, and he's too proud to ask anybody for help finding somewhere better. Thin walls, a window unit that rattles all summer, a parking spot I share with the store's delivery van. I built a business out of the back of a Ford pickup once. I want you to hold on to that fact, because it matters for where this story is headed, and it is nowhere near where it starts. Denise tells the flushing story so well by now that I've heard second-hand versions of it come back to me with details I don't even recognize. A toilet seat left up for a week, arguments about it at 2 in the morning, none of it exactly true, all of it close enough to sound true to somebody who wasn't in the house. It's a good story, I'll give her that. It's humiliating in a way that's easy to laugh at, easy to repeat at a dinner table, easy for our son to believe about a father he'd already half decided wasn't worth much. Nobody ever asks the obvious question when they hear it. Nobody ever asks why a woman would end a 28-year marriage over something so small, unless the real reason was something she couldn't say out loud in mixed company. I heard it once secondhand, from a man I used to bowl with, a version where I'd apparently refused to fix a running toilet for 6 months out of pure stubbornness, refused to even acknowledge it was broken, until Denise finally packed a bag out of sheer exhaustion. I sat there in that bowling alley and laughed along with everybody else, because what else do you do, and drove home afterward with my hands tight on the wheel, thinking about how thoroughly a story like that erases 28 years of a real marriage, real children, real grief, and replaces it with something you can tell in under a minute and still get a laugh. Welcome to Brian's Revenge. If that opening's already got you curious, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and stick with me, because what I'm about to tell you took me 12 years to say out loud to anybody, and I think you're going to understand by the end exactly why I kept it to myself for so long. I found the first text message on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 years ago, on a phone Denise had left charging on the kitchen counter while she showered. I wasn't looking for anything. I want that on the record, because I know how this sounds. Her phone lit up with a name I didn't recognize, a preview line that didn't need context to understand what it meant. I stood in my own kitchen at 46 years old and read 6 months of messages in 12 minutes, my coffee going cold beside me, and by the time Denise came downstairs in her robe, humming something from the radio, I already knew more about my marriage than she thought I did. I didn't say. I want you to understand that too, because it matters for everything that came after. I'd built Coil Machine Works from nothing, one used lathe and a line of credit I'd begged a local bank into giving me at 28 years old. And by the time I found that phone glowing on the counter, it was a business with 11 employees and Denise's name on half of everything, because she'd done the books since the beginning, and I'd never once thought to separate what was mine from what was ours. I had a business to run, 2 kids in high school, and a wife I'd loved since we were 19 years old standing in front of me every single morning like nothing at all had changed. I didn't know how to blow up a life that size over a phone screen, so I didn't. Not right away. I remember that whole week after finding those messages in a strange, detached kind of clarity, like I was watching my own life from a few feet outside my body. I went to work. I quoted a job for a plastics manufacturer in Joplin. I came home and ate dinner across the table from Denise and asked Todd about his algebra test and told Michelle her science fair volcano looked good enough to actually erupt And the entire time some cold, careful part of my mind was cataloging every detail of what I'd read that morning, the name, the timestamps, the specific words she'd used with a man who wasn't me. I didn't sleep much that week. I remember lying awake next to her at 2 in the morning, listening to her breathe, feeling like I was lying next to a stranger wearing my wife's face. I told myself, for a long while, that maybe it had been a one-time thing, a moment of weakness in a marriage that had otherwise been solid for 2 decades. I wanted to believe that badly enough that I nearly convinced myself of it, right up until I found the second name 8 months later. A man I later learned was a client of the accounting firm where Denise worked part-time, someone she'd apparently been seeing on and off for the better part of a year by the time I found out. That was the week something in me finally went quiet in a different way, not the raw, wounded quiet of the first discovery, but something colder and more permanent, the quiet of a man deciding, without fully admitting it to himself yet, that the marriage he'd built his whole adult life around had already ended, even though nobody had said so out loud. It wasn't the only one. I found the second one 8 months later, a different name this time, and by then I'd stopped being surprised and started being something colder, something more careful. I kept what I found. Screenshots, printed pages folded into an envelope, dated and initialed like evidence, because some part of me even then understood I might need it someday, even if I couldn't have told you what for. If you've made it this far, I want you to sit with something before I go any further, because it's going to matter for how you judge the next part of this story. I'm not going to pretend what I did next was the right thing. I'm only going to tell you what actually happened, because the truth is worse and better than the story Denise has spent 12 years telling instead. I met Carol at a hardware trade show in Kansas City, 11 months after I found that second text message. A supplier rep from a fastener company with a laugh that carried across a convention floor, and a way of looking at a person like they were the only interesting thing in the room. We talked for 40 minutes at a hotel bar that first night about nothing at all, bolts and shipping delays and a daughter she was putting through nursing school, and I want to tell you I felt guilty the whole drive home. I did feel guilty. It didn't stop me from calling her the following week. Carol was easy in a way my marriage hadn't been in years, easy in the specific way that comes from two people who both already know, somewhere underneath the conversation, that neither one of them is asking the other for a future. She never once asked me to leave Denise, never once asked what our arrangement meant, or where it was going, or whether I loved her the way I once loved my wife. We'd meet at a diner off I-44 sometimes, other times just talk on the phone for an hour while I sat in my truck in a parking lot somewhere. And for those stretches of time, I felt something I hadn't felt at home in years, which was simply being looked at by somebody who wasn't already halfway somewhere else in her mind. For the next 3 years, until the divorce, I saw Carol maybe once a month, sometimes less, always somewhere far enough from Springfield that nobody who knew Denise would recognize either one of us. I told myself, the way people always tell themselves these things, that it wasn't the same as what Denise had done, that I'd found out first, that I was owed something for staying quiet as long as I had. I don't fully believe that anymore if I ever did. What I believed mostly was that I'd already lost the marriage the morning I read those messages on the kitchen counter, and everything after that was just two people going through the motions of a life that had already ended, both of us keeping secrets we decided the other one didn't deserve to hear. I lost track of Carol not long after the divorce filing started, the way you lose track of a person who was only ever meant to exist inside a very specific. She sent a card 2 years later when her daughter finished nursing school, a short note that said she hoped I was doing all right, and I never wrote back, not because I didn't care, but because by then I understood that whatever we'd had belonged entirely to a version of my life I was trying badly to leave behind me. Denise found out about Carol 11 months before the divorce filing, from a receipt she found in my truck, And I remember the fight that followed better than almost anything else from those years, because it was the only time in 28 years of marriage I ever saw her go completely silent instead of loud. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at me for a long moment and said, very quietly, "We're done, Raymond," and walked out of the kitchen. And I understood even then that whatever came next was going to be about controlling the story, not about the truth of what had actually happened between us. That's exactly what it became. Denise filed for divorce 4 months later, told our son Todd, who was 22 and already halfway convinced his father was a disappointment, some version of events that made her the wronged party, without ever once mentioning her own name showing up on 2 different men's phones over 6 years of marriage. And somewhere in the retelling, sometime over those first raw months, the story softened into something easier to repeat at parties, something that didn't require explaining infidelity to a room full of church friends. She left me, she told everybody, because I never remembered to flush the toilet. Small, forgivable, almost funny. Exactly the kind of thing you can say about a man without ever having to explain what actually happened to your marriage. 10 years ago, in the divorce settlement, Coil Machine Works got split according to what our original postnuptial agreement laid out, an agreement Denise's attorney had pushed hard for 11 years into the marriage, back during a rocky stretch when I'd made some comment, half joking, about how many hours the fastener reps company kept me traveling. Denise wanted protection, her attorney had said at the time, protection against exactly the kind of thing that had never actually happened yet from my side of things. I signed it without much of a fight because I loved her and because I didn't think I had anything to hide from at the time. The clause in that agreement, buried on page 14, said that if either spouse committed infidelity during the marriage, that spouse's share of any future liquidity event tied to the business, a sale, a buyout, a public offering, would be reduced to a base minimum, with the remainder reverting to the other spouse. Denise's attorney called it a fidelity forfeiture provision. I remember Denise herself, that year, telling her sister at a barbecue, only half joking, that it was there to keep me honest. I never once used it during the divorce. I want you to understand why. Todd was 22. Michelle was 19. And I didn't want either one of my kids growing up with a courtroom transcript detailing exactly how many men their mother had been with while I was building a business to support all 4 of us. So I let the settlement go through evenly, both of us walking away with roughly half of what the company was worth at the time. And I let Denise keep telling her toilet story, because the alternative meant dragging my own children through something uglier than either of us deserved to carry. I sold my half of the business 2 years after the divorce, needed the cash more than I needed the equity, and Denise and her new husband Gary bought me out at a fair price and kept building the company from there. I took a job managing a machine shop for somebody else, the first time in 30 years I'd worked for a paycheck instead of a P&L statement, and I moved into the apartment above the hardware store on Kearney Street, and that's where I've been ever since. 60 years old, still hearing, every so often, some second-hand version of a story about a toilet seat that was never actually the reason for anything. If you've stuck with me this far, tell me in the comments whether you think I made the right call keeping quiet for my kids' sake, because I've gone back and forth on it for 12 years myself, and I still don't fully know the answer. But stay with me, because what happened 6 weeks ago is going to change how you think about that answer too. Todd's 34 now, works in commercial insurance in Kansas City, married to a woman named Britt who I've met maybe 4 times in 6. He calls Denise every Sunday like clockwork and calls me on a good month, maybe twice. Michelle's 31, works as a vet tech at a clinic outside Springfield, still renting the same duplex she moved into after community college, and she's the one who calls me every single week, no matter what, sometimes just to talk about nothing at all. I remember a birthday 2 years ago, my 58th, when Todd sent a gift card to a steakhouse I'd mentioned liking once, years earlier. along with a text that said, "Happy birthday, Dad. Hope works good." And Michelle showed up at my apartment unannounced with a store-bought cake and a card she'd clearly spent time picking out. Sat with me for 3 hours on my little pull-out couch watching a documentary about wolves because I'd mentioned once that I liked nature shows. And never once made either gesture feel like an obligation. That's roughly the shape of the last decade with both of my children, if I'm being honest with you. Todd remembers me the way you remember an old coworker you're still cordial with. Michelle remembers me the way you remember somebody who actually matters to your week. I started having chest pains in early spring. The kind you tell yourself is heartburn until it isn't anymore. And after a stress test that didn't look right and a cardiologist named Dr. Amara, who used the word significant more than once, I found myself sitting in a parking lot outside a clinic with a bill for $4,400 I needed to come up with before they'd schedule the procedure. I called Todd first, the way you call the child who is more, hoping, God, hoping, that whatever's grown cold between a father and son over 12 years still has enough left in it to answer a phone call like this one. "Dad," he said, after I'd explained it, his voice flat in a way that told me he'd already decided something before I'd finished the sentence. "I don't really see how that's something I should be covering. You made your choices. I'm not trying to be harsh, but you cheated on Mom and now you want me to bail you out. I found out she cheated first, Todd, years before Carol. I never told you that because you were a kid and I didn't want you carrying it." There was a pause and then colder. "That's convenient, Dad. Real convenient timing on that story. I've gotta go." The line went dead. My own son, 34 years old, hanging up on me in a clinic parking lot because his mother's version of our marriage had spent 12 years hardening into the only version he'd ever let himself believe. I called Michelle that same evening, ashamed to even be making the call, the way you get ashamed asking your youngest, the one who's never had much to spare, for something her successful brother had just refused outright. "Dad, stop," she said, the second I started explaining. "How much and by when?" "Michelle, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm asking you what the number is." I heard something rustle on her end, a drawer, maybe papers. "I've got about 600 saved. I can pick up extra shifts at the clinic. Dr. Feld's been wanting somebody to cover overnight boarding checks. It pays better. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks isn't enough time for what I need, honey. Then I'll figure out the rest," she said, like it was the simplest math in the world. "Don't argue with me, Dad. I'm not losing you over a number." She sold a set of vintage tools that had been her grandfather's, my own father's old machinist tools that she'd kept on a shelf in her duplex since he passed, sold them to a collector in Branson for $1,100 without telling me until after it was done. Took on every overnight shift Dr. Feld would give her for 3 straight weeks, coming home some mornings still smelling like antiseptic and kennel disinfectant, catching a few hours of sleep before her regular daytime shift started all over again. Sold a bracelet Denise had given her one Christmas that she'd never once worn, said she didn't need it and I did. I found out about the overnight shifts almost by accident, calling her one evening around 11 and getting the clinic's after-hours line instead of her cell, a recording that mentioned boarding services were staffed through the night by appointment. When I asked her about it the next day, she brushed it off fast, said it was extra money, no big deal. Wolves need somebody to check on them too, Dad trying to make a joke of it the way she always did when she didn't want. I worried anyway. I worried about my 31-year-old daughter sleeping 4 hours a night to pay for a surgery her own brother had refused to help with, and I didn't know, not yet, that I was about to be handed away to make sure she never had to sleep like that again. By the end of those 3 weeks, she'd put together the full $4,400, mostly her own money, some of it a small loan from a coworker she still hadn't fully paid back by the time I found. She never once made me feel the weight of it. Never once brought up Todd's refusal, never once asked me to explain the thing I'd said on the phone about her mother, though I could tell, in the careful way she avoided the subject, that she'd heard some version of it from Todd and was choosing, deliberately, not to make me relive it. Welcome back if you stepped away for the CTA block. And if you didn't, That's exactly where you should be, because everything up to this point was the setup. What happened 4 weeks after my surgery is the part neither of my children saw coming, and it started with an offer letter that had nothing to do with me at all, at least not at first glance. The surgery went well, a stent placed, clean recovery, and Michelle drove me home from the hospital herself and stayed 3 nights on my pull-out couch, checking on me at odd hours like she still didn't fully trust me to be alone. Todd sent a text 4 days after the procedure. "Hope you're doing okay." 4 words that told me everything about where I stood in his accounting of things. It was Michelle, actually, who brought me the news, 4 weeks into my recovery, sitting at my little kitchen table with a magazine open to a business section article she'd found while waiting at the vet clinic. "Dad, isn't this your old company?" A private equity group out of Chicago called Aldermere Partners had made an unsolicited offer to acquire Coil Machine Works. The article said, "A regional manufacturer known for precision fastener components, valued in the acquisition at just under $19 million. I sat very still at that table for a long moment, thinking about a lathe I'd bought used with a begged bank loan 32 years ago, thinking about Denise doing the books at our kitchen table back when the company was still small enough to fit inside a single ledger. $19 million, I thought, and I sold my half for a fraction of what it's worth now, 2 years after the divorce, because I needed cash and didn't have the stomach to fight for more. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters. I didn't feel angry reading that article. I felt something closer to old grief, the ordinary kind that comes from watching something you built become valuable to somebody else long after you've let go of it. It wasn't until 3 days later, going through an old fireproof lockbox I hadn't opened in years looking for a copy of my original divorce decree for a Medicare form, that the grief turned into something else entirely. The postnuptial agreement was still in there, yellowed at the edges, page 14 still marked with a paperclip I'd put there myself 12 years ago and never removed. I read that fidelity forfeiture clause again for the first time in over a decade, slower this time, with a clarity I hadn't had the stomach for back when I was trying to keep my children out of a courtroom. I remember sitting at that kitchen table for the better part of an hour after I first reread it, the Medicare form I'd originally gone looking for still sitting untouched beside me, completely forgotten. I thought about the afternoon Denise's attorney had first presented that clause to me, in a conference room with bad coffee and a view of the courthouse parking lot, how Denise had sat beside me nodding along, calling it reasonable, calling it fair, calling it the kind of protection any sensible couple builds into a marriage when one partner travels as much as I did for work. I remember signing it without much thought, because I loved her, and because 11 years into a marriage I still believed was solid. The idea of my own infidelity being the thing that clause needed to guard against seemed almost laughably distant. Any liquidity event tied to Coil Machine Works, including but not limited to a sale, merger, or acquisition of the company or a controlling interest therein, occurring at any point following the dissolution of the marriage, shall be subject to this provision, regardless of the timing of such event relative to the divorce decree, so long as the underlying infidelity is established by a preponderance of evidence, regardless of the timing. I read that phrase probably 10 times. Denise's attorney had drafted that clause to survive the marriage itself, to reach forward into any future sale, any future decade, so long as the infidelity could be proven. Denise's attorney, working entirely on Denise's instructions, had built a clause designed to punish me if the company ever sold big after a divorce triggered by my infidelity. Nobody in that room, 11 years into my marriage, had considered what would happen if the infidelity turned out to run the other. I still had the envelope, 14 years old, screenshots and printed pages, dated and initialed, sitting in the bottom of the same fireproof lockbox where I'd kept it since the morning I first found that phone glowing on the kitchen counter. I'd never once used it, never even told my own children it existed. I sat there at my kitchen table with that envelope in my hands and thought about a son who'd hung up on me in a clinic parking lot because his mother's version of events had become the only version he was willing to believe, and a daughter who'd sold her grandfather's tools without complaint to save my life. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I didn't call Todd. I didn't call Denise. I want you to remember that because it matters for what. I never hid what I knew from anybody out of malice. I simply hadn't found one single reason in 12 years to hand either of them a weapon I'd spent that whole time refusing to use. I called an attorney instead, a woman named Louise Pruitt who'd handled some contract work for my old machine shop employer and had a reputation, I'd heard around town, for being meticulous with exactly this kind of old paperwork. Louise, it's Raymond Coyle. I need you to look at a postnuptial agreement from my divorce, and I need to know whether a clause in it is still enforceable 12 years later, given a sale that's about to happen to a company I used to co-own. She called me back 2 days later, after reading through what I'd sent her, papers shuffling audibly on her end of the line. Raymond, this clause is unusual, but it's not unenforceable. Your ex-wife's attorney drafted it with language that explicitly survives the divorce and reaches forward to any future liquidity event, provided you can establish the underlying infidelity by a preponderance of the evidence, which is a lower bar than you'd think. What you've described to me, dated messages, printed and initialed contemporaneously, is exactly the kind of documentation that clears that bar without much difficulty. Does that mean what I think it means, Louise? Does it mean I have a claim against Denise's proceeds from this Aldermere sale? It very likely does, she said. A significant one. The clause reduces the offending spouse's share to a contractually defined minimum and redirects the balance to the other party. Based on the numbers in that article, we're talking about a substantial redirection, Raymond. Potentially several $1,000,000, depending on how Denise's current ownership percentage nets out against Gary's. I asked her, before we hung up that first call, whether she thought I was doing the right thing, pursuing something I'd sat on for 12 years out of a decision to protect my own kids. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. Raymond, I can only tell you what the law allows. Whether it's right is a question only you can answer, and it sounds like you've been carrying that question around a lot longer than these last few weeks. I sat there in my little apartment above the hardware store, 60 years old, listening to a rattling window unit, and for the first time in 12 years I felt something that wasn't shame, wasn't old grief, wasn't the quiet ache of watching a company I'd built become somebody else's fortune. It was clarity, plain and total. Louise, I want to move on this quietly. I don't want a single soul outside this call knowing until it's filed. Not even your children, especially. I thought about a set of my own father's machinist tools sold for $1,100 in Branson, about a bracelet Michelle had never once worn because Denise had given it to her. Draw up whatever needs drawing up. Whatever comes out of this claim, I want it going into a trust. Irrevocable. Sole beneficiary Michelle Coyle. Louise didn't say anything for a second. All of it, Raymond. Whatever the claim yields, after my own legal costs and a reasonable reserve, every dollar. She sold her grandfather's tools to save my life, Louise. Took overnight shifts at a vet clinic for 3 straight weeks. Never once brought up her brother's refusal. Never once made me explain myself. Meanwhile, my son told me, in a hospital parking lot, essentially, that I'd earned whatever was happening to me. So no, I'm not splitting whatever comes from this evenly for the sake of looking fair. Fair already happened, Louise, at a kitchen table with a stack of overnight shift schedules, and only one of my children was ever part of it. I hear you, Raymond. I'll have the claim filed within the month. One more thing, Louise. When this settles, I don't want my name attached to whatever Michelle ends up with. Trust owns whatever comes through clean, no strings, nothing anybody can ever argue about later. I want it as airtight as that clause was built to be. Let's see how that feels from the other side for once. Airtight, Louise said. I understand completely. I hung up the phone and sat there a long while in that little apartment, listening to the window unit rattle, thinking about a fireproof lockbox and a paperclip that had sat on page 14 for 12 years waiting for a moment I'd never once intended to create. I thought, too, about Carol, somewhere out there living whatever life she'd built after nursing school and grandchildren and years I knew nothing about, and I found myself hoping, in an odd, distant way, that wherever she was, she'd found something steadier than what she and I had shared in those diner booths off I-44. None of this was ever really about her. It never had been. It had always been about a phone glowing on a kitchen counter, and a story somebody built afterward to keep from ever having to explain it. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. And when they do, they're not going to ask how my recovery's going. They're going to ask about money, and about an old envelope I should have burned years ago and never did. That's just who this family's become around money and old wounds. Maybe who we always were, underneath the story about a toilet seat that made it so much easier not to look at anything else. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought, because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are, and I think you're going to want to see how Denise finds out. Because she doesn't find out from me. She finds out the way I always suspected she would, from her own attorney, buried in paperwork tied to a deal she'd already started spending in her head. 5 weeks after that call with Louise, my phone rang at 8 in the evening. Todd's name on the screen for the first time since the clinic parking lot, Dad. His voice had an edge in it I didn't recognize right away. I need you to explain something to me. Explain what, Todd? Mom's attorney flagged some kind of claim against the Aldermere proceeds, a fidelity forfeiture provision. He said the words slow, like they tasted bad in his mouth. Dad, what is this? Mom says it's not true, whatever's in it. She says you're trying to punish her for the divorce, so that's how it happened, I thought. Not from me. From Denise's own attorney, doing exactly the diligence a $19 million sale requires, tripping over a clause Denise herself had insisted on drafting, 12 years before either of us imagined it would ever reach this far forward. I looked at the fireproof lockbox sitting on my kitchen table, still open from the week before, that yellowed envelope resting on top of the postnuptial agreement. I felt that clarity again, steady and cold, and entirely without doubt. I found out about that sale 6 weeks ago, Todd. Filed the claim 5 weeks ago. And no, I'm not punishing your mother for the divorce. I'm asking a court to enforce a document she asked her own attorney to write, back when she thought the only person who might ever break their vows in this marriage was me. That's not, Todd started and stopped. Dad, that's a horrible thing to accuse Mom of. She wouldn't, she would, Todd, she did. More than once, years before I ever met Carol. I never told you, because you were 22 and I didn't want you spending the rest of your life looking at your mother the way I imagine you're about to look at her tonight. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the parking lot outside my apartment window. Denise's car, Todd's beside it. They came up the outside stairs together and knocked, hard, the kind of knock that isn't really asking permission. Raymond, we need to talk about this right now, Denise said. The moment I opened the door, still in what looked like clothes from a dinner she'd been in the middle of, Gary noticeably absent, which told me something in itself. You cannot do this. Do you understand what this claim could do to the sale, to Gary's stake, to everything we've built since the divorce? Neither of them asked how the recovery from my surgery was going. Not one word about the stent, the 3 weeks of overnight shifts Michelle had worked to pay for it, the toilet story that had spent 12 years standing in for the truth. Straight to the money, same as it had always somehow ended up being, no matter how the conversation started. Sit down, both of you, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. You look like you're about to say some things you won't be able to take back, and I've had enough of that particular experience for one lifetime. Denise didn't sit. She stood in my doorway with her arms crossed, 12 years of a very carefully maintained story visibly cracking somewhere behind her eyes. Todd came in behind her, quieter than his mother, standing near the small kitchen table where the fireproof lockbox still sat open, its contents visible, the postnuptial agreement, the yellowed envelope, everything laid bare in a way I hadn't quite planned but also hadn't bothered to hide. "Is that it?" Denise said, her eyes landing on the envelope, her voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than the sharpness she'd walked in with. 12 years, Raymond, and you... I kept it because I didn't trust myself not to need it someday, I said. I didn't say that meant I ever planned to use it. For 12 years, I didn't. I let you tell whatever story you wanted about a toilet seat because our kids were young enough that I didn't want them growing up resenting their mother the way I imagine Todd's about to start resenting you tonight. "Don't," Todd said, quiet, looking at his mother instead of me. "Mom, is it true? Is there something in that envelope that's actually true?" Denise's jaw tightened, and for a long moment she didn't answer him at all, which told both of us everything we needed to know. "It was a long time ago, Todd," she finally said. "People make mistakes in a marriage. Your father made his own mistakes too, don't forget that part." "I never denied my own mistakes," I said, steady, not raising my voice. "I've never once claimed to be the wronged party in some clean, simple way. But I didn't spend 12 years telling anybody who'd listen that our marriage ended over a toilet seat, Denise. You did that. You built an entire story designed to make me look small and petty specifically so nobody would ever ask what actually happened between us. Vanessa, I mean Denise," her arms tightened further across her chest, though something in her posture had started, almost imperceptibly, to fold inward. "That story protected our kids, Raymond. It protected all of us from something ugly. It protected you," I said. "That's the part you're leaving out. It protected your reputation at church, at your sister's barbecues, at every dinner table where you needed a version of our divorce that didn't require explaining your own choices. I let you have that protection for 12 years, Denise, because I loved our kids more than I needed to be right. I'm not sure I owe you that protection anymore. Now that there's $19 million on the table and your attorney's already found the clause on his own." Todd sat down hard in the chair by my small kitchen window, the same chair Michelle usually sat in when she visited, and put his head in his hands for a moment before looking back up, something raw and unguarded in his face that I hadn't seen from my son in years. "Mom, look at me. Is what's in that envelope real?" Denise didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had lost most of its earlier sharpness, replaced by something smaller, more careful. "It doesn't matter anymore, Todd. It was a long time ago. Your father and I both did things we're not proud of." "That's not an answer," Todd said, and I watched something shift in my son's face, some old, comfortable certainty about his own family finally cracking under a weight it had never actually been built to hold. "You've been telling me for 12 years that Dad was the reason everything fell apart, that he was petty and stubborn and couldn't even remember to flush a toilet. And this whole time there was an actual reason, and it wasn't him." "I'm not saying it was all me either," Denise said, some of the old defensiveness creeping back into her voice. "Your father wasn't innocent either, Todd. He was seeing someone too, eventually." "Eventually," I said, quiet but firm. "After Denise. Not before. There's a difference. And you know there's a difference, even if it's inconvenient to say so in front of our son." The room went quiet for a long moment, nothing but the rattle of my window unit and the distant sound of traffic on Kearney Street below. Denise finally sat down, slow, at the small kitchen table across from me, some of the fight visibly draining out of her posture, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "What do you want, Raymond?" she finally asked. "If you're not doing this to hurt me, what exactly is it you want out of this claim?" "I want what that clause actually says I'm owed," I said. "Nothing more, nothing dramatic. But I'm not walking away from it quietly this time either, the way I walked away from everything else quietly for 12 years so our kids wouldn't have to know the truth." "What are you going to do with it?" Todd asked, his voice still unsteady, still working through the wreckage of a story he'd believed his entire adult life. "I already know what I'm doing with it," I said. "But that's not a conversation for tonight. Tonight was always going to be about the two of you finally hearing something closer to the truth than you've heard in 12 years. What happens with the money is a separate conversation, and it's one I've already had, quietly, with somebody I trust." Denise looked up at that, something sharp flickering back into her expression despite the exhaustion underneath it. "You've already decided something, without talking to either of us." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, thinking about a bracelet sold for money it should never have had to cover, about overnight shifts at a veterinary clinic, about a son who'd hung up on me in a parking lot, because a story about a toilet seat had been easier to believe than the truth about his own mother. I talked to plenty of people over these last 12 years, Denise. I just never talked to either of you about any of it, because you'd already decided, a long time ago, which version of this family story everybody was allowed to hear. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what I'm about to tell them, standing in that doorway with an old envelope sitting open on my kitchen table, and a clause Denise herself had insisted on writing 12 years before either of us thought it would ever matter, that's a conversation that's going to change everything about which version of this marriage my children finally choose to believe. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, standing in my own doorway, and it does not go the way either of them walked up those stairs expecting.